Welcome to the deep dive. If you're tracking the energy transition, you've definitely heard the phrase that really defined the last decade or so for solar power. Grid parity. It's
Mm.
that key moment, right?
Yeah.
Where the cost of generating electricity from a solar photovoltaic system, PV, maybe on your own roof, is actually cheaper than buying it from the utility.
Exactly. And to really understand how PV made that leap, from a niche tech to a major player, we're actually going back to a really influential paper today. It's called Global Overview on Grid Parity, published back in 2013.
2013. Okay, so the data is a bit older.
Yeah, the data was largely from around 2011, but the predictive model they built, it basically set the benchmark for thinking about this over the next 10 years.
Got it. So our mission today is to unpack this study because its scope was just huge. I mean, they weren't just looking at the usual suspects like Germany or California.
No, not at all. They analyzed the path to competitiveness across, what was it, over 150 countries?
Yeah, and over 305 different market segments within those countries. It covered almost 98% of the world's population. Truly a global economic perspective.
And what's really striking looking back at it now is just the confidence that showed. Even then, back in 2013, it wasn't based on wishful thinking.
Yeah.
They built this dynamic economic model to figure out precisely, when and where grid parity would happen for residential markets, for industrial markets, across Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia Pacific.
And finding.
It was pretty blunt, actually. They said grid parity events were already happening, and they predicted that during the 2010s, PV penetration would reach somewhere between 75% and 90% of the total global electricity market.
Wow. Okay, that is a staggering forecast for a 10-year period,
Yeah.
especially looking forward from 2013. So let's dig into that. A market shift that big, I mean, it doesn't happen by accident. The economics have to be driving it hard.
Absolutely.
So what's the core mechanism here?
Uh.
What's pushing PV costs down so incredibly fast that this parity becomes, well, inevitable?
Well, the whole foundation rests on basically two key concepts. They bring together the finance side and the technology side. First up is the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE.
LCOE, right. Heard that a lot.
Yeah, and it's crucial because it's the comparison tool. It lets you take all the complicated stuff, the upfront investment, the capital costs, CAPEX, the ongoing running costs, OPEX, and boils it all down into one simple figure.
Like a cost per kilowatt hour.
Exactly. The true cost per kilowatt hour over the entire lifetime of the system. So you can compare apples to apples.
Okay, so LCOE gives us the real lifetime cost of solar generation. And we compare that against what the utility charges at retail. But the study points out a big distortion there, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A huge one. When this study calculated the PV LCOE, they were very clear. They did not include any subsidies for solar PV.
Okay, so the unsubsidized cost.
Exactly. They wanted the true cost. But crucially, they made sure to point out the massive support structures for the competition, meaning existing subsidies for fossil fuels.
And the number they put on that, it's pretty eye-watering.
It really is. At the time they did the analysis, global subsidies just for fossil fuels were estimated at over 310 billion US dollars
Nah.
per year.
Wow. Just take a second to think about that. You've got this new technology, PV, trying to compete on cost. And its main competitor has over $300 billion every single year, basically propping up its prices. I mean, if you just hypothetically strip that away,
Yeah.
wouldn't parity have happened even faster? Years sooner, maybe.
Without a doubt. I mean, that was kind of the study's point. Even with that massive financial headwind, the sheer economic momentum of PV technology itself was just, overwhelming.
And that momentum comes from the second concept you mentioned.
Yes, exactly. It comes from the experience curve.
The experience curve. This is where it gets really interesting, right? This is the industrial principle that explains how getting bigger makes you cheaper, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. It's an empirical law, something observed across many industries. It basically says that every time the total cumulative global production of something doubles, the cost of making it drops by a fairly stable percentage. And that percentage is called the learning rate. For PV manufacturing, historically, that learning rate has been remarkably stable at around 20%.
20%. That sounds
Yeah.
huge. Is that high compared to other technologies?
It's incredibly high. It's kind of PV's unique superpower, you could say. If you compare it to, say, wind power, another successful renewable tech, wind typically shows a learning rate maybe around 10%.
So why is PV double that?
Well, it really boils down to the manufacturing process. Wind turbines are these huge, often customized mechanical things assembled out in the field. PV modules, on the other hand, they're standardized, highly automated electronic products, silicon-based, made in these ultra-clean factory settings.
More like semiconductor manufacturing.
Exactly. That inherent sort of mass producibility allows for a much steeper and more consistent cost reduction curve.
Okay, so the study had this powerful cost engine, the 20% learning rate, and this massive $310 billion hurdle from fossil fuel subsidies. So what were the key assumptions they plugged into their model for the 2010-2020 decade? The ones that led to those really aggressive 75–90% market penetration numbers?
Well, interestingly, they actually described their own growth assumptions as conservative. They used an annual growth rate of 30% for global PV markets.
30%, okay.
But they pointed out that this was conservative because the industry's actual average growth for the 15 years before that had been 45%. So they literally built in a slowdown into their own forecasts.
Hold on, so they were predicting 75–90% market share by the end of the 2010s.
Yeah.
Even while assuming growth would slow down significantly from its historical pace.
Sure.
That's not just optimism. That's basically saying the technology's cost reduction is so powerful it'll take over regardless of market speed.
That's precisely the implication. And on the other side of the equation, the price people pay for electricity, they assumed prices would keep going up, but moderately.
Moderately.
They used rates like 5%, 3%, or 1% per year, depending on how high the price already was. So, higher rates for initially cheaper markets, lower rates for already expensive ones, sort of acknowledging that really high prices might face political pushback eventually.
Okay, so with that model running, let's look at where they predicted things would happen first. The study talked about 4 phases of PV diffusion, but we're mostly interested in phase 3, right? The grid parity phase.
That's right. Phase 1 was super niche, like powering satellites. Phase 2 was off-grid, which was crucial for remote areas, often making PV the cheapest option way back. Phase 3 is our focus, competing directly with the grid price.
And phase 4.
Phase 4, which they saw coming even then, was utility-scale PV reaching what they called fuel parity. We can touch on that later.
Okay, so focusing on phase 3 grid parity for homes and businesses, what really jumped out from the regional results? What was the magic combination for hitting parity early?
Well, the common thread was pretty clear. It was a combination of good sunshine and high local electricity prices. Simple as that, really.
Geography meets economics.
Exactly. The sheer force of that 20% learning rate meant the LCOE in sunny places was forecast to just plummet. They projected it would go from around 0.16 per kilowatt hour in 2010 down to just 0.06 by 2020 in those high sun regions.
Cutting the costs by more than 60% in just 10 years? That's the engine right there.
That's the engine. And maybe the clearest example of this was what the study called the island effect.
The island effect.
Yeah, places like Cyprus, nations in the Caribbean, Seychelles, these often showed the very earliest grid parity events. And the reason is simple. Islands usually don't have their own fossil fuels.
So they have to import expensive fuel.
Right. They import oil or diesel to run their power plants, which means electricity prices for people living there are often incredibly high. So PV gets this instant, huge cost advantage.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Okay, moving beyond islands to the bigger continents. How did the major regions stack up in their 2010-2020 projections?
Well, for Europe and the Americas, the model showed really rapid and widespread adoption. The prediction was that by the end of that decade, most market segments wouldn't just reach grid parity, they'd be beyond it. Cheaper than the grid.
Significantly cheaper.
Yeah, like they projected 99% of residential segments in the Americas would find PV cheaper than utility power by 2020.
99%. Wow. And what about the fast-growing economies over in Asia Pacific?
Pretty similar story, actually. Rapid progress expected. Early parity in places with high costs already, like Japan, Cambodia, the Philippines.
But there were holdouts.
Yes, and the pattern repeats. The resistance, if you like, was mainly in oil-producing Asian countries. Why? Because they often have heavy government energy subsidies, keeping consumer electricity prices artificially low.
So the subsidies were masking the true economics again.
Exactly, delaying parity And
And that same pattern subsidies slowing things down despite good resources showed up in Africa too, right? which obviously has incredible solar potential.
Yes, absolutely. The study showed early parity was likely in many West African countries, places like Gambia, Mali, but it really highlighted that the continent's biggest electricity consumers, specifically South Africa and Egypt, had very heavy subsidies in their energy markets.
Overriding the good sunshine?
Pretty much. Those subsidies pushed the predicted grid parity date for those major markets out beyond 2020 in the model. It really underscores how political choices, like subsidies, can act as a barrier even when the geography and technology are favorable.
It's also really important to remember, while we're talking about grid parity for people on the grid,
Yeah.
the whole concept is kind of irrelevant for a massive number of people globally.
That's a crucial point, yes.
Yeah.
We absolutely have to acknowledge the, 1.5 billion people worldwide who just don't have access to electricity at all. Many of them live in incredibly sunny places.
Right. There's no grid for PV to compete with.
Exactly. For that huge population, off-grid PV, whether it's a small solar lantern or a village microgrid, isn't about parity. It's often already the cheapest, most practical, most economic solution for getting basic energy access. It's solving a fundamental need and bypassing the whole grid debate entirely.
So bringing it back to the grid-connected world, once PV starts mastering this grid parity challenge, competing with those retail rates, the study suggested the industry had its sights set on the next big target.
Yes, the next milestone, fuel parity. This is phase 4. This is where big utility-scale PV power plants become cheaper on an LCOE basis than traditional oil-fired power plants.
So now PV is competing directly with large-scale conventional generation?
Exactly, head-to-head with bulk power generation assets. And the paper noted this was already starting to happen in parts of the Middle East, even back when they wrote it.
And the impact of reaching fuel parity is, well, it's huge.
Yeah.
Because PV stops being just a rooftop thing and becomes a potential backbone of the national energy supply.
It's transformative. Once solar farms are actually cheaper to run than oil plants, PV can be deployed purely as a fuel-saving technology. It generates direct economic benefits and reduces greenhouse gas emissions, even in countries that historically relied heavily on burning oil for electricity.
The cost savings themselves become the main driver.
Precisely.
So given this powerful economic trajectory, this shift towards parity, what did the study suggest this means for governments and policymakers? Especially since the model implied PV's success was almost baked in.
Well, it kind of flips the policy need. Once you hit widespread grid parity, the need for direct subsidies for PV starts to fade away. But at the same time, it creates this urgent need for new political frameworks. Frameworks designed to maximize the social benefits that come from this cheap electricity.
How so? Can you give an example?
Yeah, the study used Spain as an example because Spain hit parity quite early. The analysis showed that the financial headroom created by cheap PV was so significant, it could actually fund the next wave of grid solutions like decentralized battery storage.
Without needing new government programs.
That was the implication. They calculated that in a place like Spain, it might only take about 4 years after hitting grid parity for the savings from a PV system to effectively pay for adding local battery storage.
Wow. So the economic benefit from generating your own cheap power becomes so large, it naturally pays for the next piece of the puzzle storage kind of automatically, driven by the market itself.
Exactly. It's a really powerful example of market forces potentially driving grid modernization.
And finally, let's just circle back to that core assumption we talked about earlier, the 30% annual growth rate they used in the model.
Right, the conservative one.
Yeah. Given that the historical rate was 45% and, well, the industry has generally blown past that 30% rate in the year since 2013, did the study itself acknowledge that their timeline might end up being too slow?
Yes, they strongly indicated that because their parameter settings, especially that growth rate, were deliberately cautious, the actual timeline for grid parity kicking in across the globe might well be significantly faster than even their own 2013 paper projected.
So they gave us the conservative estimate, and reality basically said, hold my beer.
Pretty much, yeah. The real world beat the conservative forecast.
This analysis from that 2013 study, Global Overview on Grid Parity, it really is stunning, just the sheer breadth of it, covering the whole globe and that confidence in the underlying economics. It really showed The solar transition wasn't just hopeful thinking.
No, it was about industrial momentum, driven fundamentally by that experience curve, that relentless cost reduction.
It absolutely reinforces the conclusion, doesn't it? PV was poised then, and in many places now has proven it can be a hugely competitive major source of electricity. It's moving way beyond needing subsidies simply because the economics are so compelling.
And offering all sorts of positive social and environmental impacts worldwide as a result.
Indeed. So we started this deep dive knowing that this 2013 study projected PV-LCOE in sunny regions would drop from about €1.16 down to 0.06 per kilowatt between 2010 and 2020, given that PV growth kept exceeding their conservative forecasts in the years after the paper. What does that imply about where electricity generation costs are today? Think about those 2020 projections as a baseline. What cost is solar hitting right now? That's definitely something for you to mull over.